Homeless at 23, with just $10 left in her pocket, Margaret Holloway made a decision that nobody on that riverbank could understand. Instead of buying a hot meal, instead of paying for one safe night under a roof, she handed over every last cent she had for a sunken riverboat. Yes, half drowned in the muddy current, listing badly to one side, abandoned for almost 40 years. People told her she was out of her mind. One old man at the dock said she would not last a single night near that wreck without falling to the rotted deck and never coming back up. But what Margaret Holloway built inside that broken riverboat over the month that followed, nobody could have predicted. Not the people who laughed when she dragged her single duffel bag down to the water. Not the man who sold the wreck to her for the price of a sandwich. Not the strangers who passed by and shook their heads. Not even Margaret herself, when she first stepped onto that warped, splintered deck and felt the whole structure groan under her weight. Because what started as desperation, what started as a very last move of a young woman with nowhere left to fall, slowly became something so unexpected, so quietly powerful, that by the end of it grown men stood on the bank with their hats in their hands and could not find the right words. If you think this is just another story about hard times, please stay with me. This is not that. Hidden inside that sunken riverboat was the beginning of something nobody saw coming, including the people who had once turned their backs on Margaret. And before we go any further, if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love hearing from you. At 23 years old, Margaret Holloway had already learned what it meant to lose everything in a way that did not happen all at once. It happened the way the river itself moved. Slow, steady, almost gentle, until you realized one morning that the bank you used to stand on was gone. There had been a small apartment over a feed store. There had been a job at a roadside diner where she poured coffee for truckers who called her honey and left quarters as tips. There had been a man she thought she would marry, a man named Caleb who said the right things at the right times until the day he didn't. And there had been a mother somewhere far up north who stopped answering the phone after the third unpaid hospital bill landed on her kitchen table. By the time Margaret stood on that riverbank, the whole map of her life had folded down into a duffel bag, a thin denim jacket, a pair of boots she had glued the soles back onto twice, and 10 crumpled dollars she had earned washing dishes for a woman 2 towns over. The wind off the water carried a smell of damp wood and old fish and engine oil, and she pulled her jacket tighter and tried not to think about how cold it was going to be once the sun finished its slow drop behind the willows on the far shore. The riverboat sat about 30 feet out from the bank. It was tilted hard to the port side, the lower deck partly submerged, the upper deck still mostly above the water, sagging in the middle as if something heavy had stood there too long and walked away. The paddle wheel at the stern was frozen in place, half its blades broken, the rest crusted with a green slime that came from years of standing water. A name had been painted on the bow once, long ago. Margaret could just barely make out the curve of the letters under all the peeling. She thought it might have started with A.B. She wasn't sure. A short wooden walkway ran out to the boat from a sandbar that the river had pushed up over the years. The walkway was uneven and missing planks. It looked like the kind of thing you would warn a child to stay away from. Margaret stood at the start of it with her duffel bag at her feet and tried to make her hands stop shaking. She told herself it was just the cold. You don't want to be standing there much longer, miss. The voice came from behind her, and Margaret turned around with the careful slowness of someone who had learned the hard way not to startle when a stranger spoke. The man was old. He was wearing a canvas coat that had seen more winters than she had, and his beard was the color of river silt. He was holding a metal coffee thermos in one hand and a small ring of keys in the other. "That boat hasn't been right since before you were born," he said. "Folks call it bad luck just to look at it." Margaret found her voice. "Who owns it?" The old man laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was a laugh of a man who had been asked many strange questions over the course of his life. "I do," he said, "for what little that's worth." His name, she would learn in a moment, was Walter Coombs, and he had run the small marina on this stretch of river for 41 years. He had bought the riverboat from a bank in 1986, planning to fix her up, and the river had risen that next spring and put a hole in her starboard side, and he had simply never had the money or the heart to do anything about it. "I keep meaning to have her hauled out and burned," he told Margaret, looking past her at the wreck with an expression that was not entirely without affection. "But every year I don't, and every year she's still there." Margaret did not look at him when she asked her next question. She kept her eyes on the boat. "How much would you take for her?" Walter Coombs went very quiet. The wind moved through the willows. Somewhere a heron called once, and then was silent. "Miss," he said finally, "you don't have anywhere to go tonight, do you?" Margaret did not answer. The truth was loud enough on its own. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the boat. Then he looked at her again. And this time something in his face softened, the way the face of an old man softens when he sees something he is not expected to see. $10, he said. Margaret's breath caught. "What?" "I said $10. She's not safe. She's not sound. She's barely even a boat anymore. But if you've got $10 and you want her, she's yours, and I'll throw in the key to the upper cabin door, which is the only door on her that still locks. I'll write you a bill of sale right now on the back of a coffee receipt, and I'll sign it, and that's the end of it." He paused. "But, miss, I want you to listen to me. That boat is not a place to live. The lower deck is half underwater. The wood is rotten in places you can't see. If you fall through in the wrong spot, the river takes you, and nobody finds you until spring." Margaret heard him. She heard every word. She also heard the wind, and she heard the cold creeping into her bones, and she heard the very quiet voice somewhere deep inside her chest that had been telling her for the last 6 months that she was running out of choices. She reached into her pocket. The $10 bill was warm from being held against her body. She held it out. Walter took it slowly. He shook his head once, like a man who knew he was doing something he could not entirely justify, and then he handed her the small brass key on its faded ring. "Cabin's at the top of the stairs on the starboard side," he said. "Mind the third step. It gives." He hesitated. "Miss, what's your name?" "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Holloway." "Well, Miss Holloway," he said, "I run the marina up the bank there. The light stays on all night. If something happens out there, you holler. I'll hear you." And then he walked away. Margaret stood on the bank for a long time after he was gone. The sky had turned the color of an old bruise. She picked up her duffel bag. She walked to the start of the wooden walkway. She put her foot on the first plank. It held. She put her foot on the second plank. It held. She remembered to skip the third. The river moved underneath her, slow and dark and patient, and she walked out the boat she now owned, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had a door she could lock behind her. That first night nearly broke her. The cabin at the top of the stairs was small, about the size of a bathroom in a cheap motel. There was a built-in bench along one wall that might have been a bed once, and a tiny round window over a bench, and a brass lamp bolted to a small fold-down table. And that was all. Everything was damp. Everything smelled like the inside of an old book that had been left out in the rain. Margaret sat on the bench with her duffel bag in her lap and listened to the boat creak around her, the river push against the hull in slow, heavy nudges, and every nudge made the whole structure shift just enough that her stomach tightened. Somewhere below her, water dripped. Somewhere further below, water moved. She did not sleep. Not really. She closed her eyes and opened them and closed them again, and at some point the gray light of morning began to come into the round window, and she was still alive, and the boat was still there, and she was still on it. She stepped out onto the upper deck just after sunrise. The river looked different in the morning. It was not the dark, hungry thing it had been the night before. It was wide and brown and slow, and the willows on the far bank were pale green with new leaves, and somewhere a kingfisher was calling, and the air smelled like mud and growing things. Margaret stood at the rail and looked at the wreck under her feet, really looked at it, in the daylight, for the first time. The deck was warped. There were places where she could see straight down through gaps in the boards to the dark water moving below. The railing was missing entire sections. The roof of the wheelhouse had a hole in it the size of a dinner plate. The paddle wheel at the stern was a ruin, but the boat was still floating. Most of it, and it was hers. She walked back to Marina that morning, and she stood in front of Walter Coombs in his small dusty office, and she said, "I need work. Anything. I'll do anything. I just need a way to keep going." Walter looked up from his ledger. He looked at her face for a long moment. Then he said, "I've got a deck that needs scraping and painting before the season starts. Pays minimum wage. You bring your own water bottle." Margaret nodded once. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it more than she had ever meant anything. For the first 2 weeks, Margaret simply survived. She worked at the marina from sunrise until her arms shook. She scraped old paint from boats that belonged to other people, and she earned enough each day to buy bread and peanut butter and a single can of something hot. And she carried her food back out across the wooden walkway to her boat, and she ate it sitting on the upper deck with her back against the wheelhouse wall, watching the river go by. At night she locked the cabin door, and she lay on the bench in her denim jacket and her boots, and she listened to boat creak, and slowly, very slowly, the creaking stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like a language she was learning to understand. The boat told her things. She started to notice. When the wind came from the south, the hull made a low, hollow sound on the port side, and that meant the listing was worse, which meant water was getting in somewhere new. When the wind came from the north, the upper deck creaked in a long, rolling rhythm that meant the main beam was holding but tired. When it rained hard, water came down the inside of the wheelhouse wall in 3 distinct streams, and Margaret learned where to put a tin can to catch each one. She had no plan. She had no skills. She had only her hands and her time and the long, patient lessons the boat was teaching her every hour of every day. Then one afternoon, Walter Coombs walked out across the wooden walkway with a toolbox in his hand and a roll of plastic sheeting over his shoulder. He did not say anything. He set the toolbox down on the deck. He looked at Margaret. He said, "I'm going to show you how to patch a hole in a hull. You're going to learn how to do it, because I'm not coming out here every time it rains." Margaret stared at him. "Why?" she said. Walter looked at the river. He looked at the boat. He looked at Margaret, who had not eaten a real meal in 3 days and whose hands were raw from scraping paint. "Because my wife passed 11 years ago," he said quietly, "and the only thing she ever asked me, the very last thing, was to be useful to somebody who needed it. I have not been very good at keeping that promise. I am going to start today." And he opened the toolbox. That was how it began. Not all at once. Not with any great announcement. Just an old man, a young woman, a sunken riverboat, and a toolbox. Walter taught her how to mix marine epoxy. He taught her how to find a leak by listening for the pitch of the dripping water. He taught her that wood that was wet was not necessarily wood that was rotten, and that wood that looked solid could turn out to be punky underneath, and that the only way to know the difference was to push a screwdriver into it and see what happened. He taught her the names of things. Stringer, knee, transom, bilge, words she had never had any reason to know, words that now became as familiar to her as her own name. And every evening when the work was done, Walter would walk back across the wooden walkway, and Margaret would stay, and she would sit on the upper deck with her hands in her lap, looking at the small things she had repaired that day, and she would feel something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not happiness. It was not even hope. Not yet. It was something quieter than either of those. It was a feeling of being on her own side for the first time in years. The first real change came the day she patched the hull on her own. Walter had been called away to deal with a generator at the marina, and Margaret had a section of the lower deck that she had been studying for 3 days, and she decided, alone, with no one watching, that she was going to fix it. She mixed the epoxy the way he had taught her. She cut the patch from a piece of marine plywood she had pulled out of a dumpster behind the boat repair shop 2 miles up the road. She braced herself in the half-submerged lower deck with the cold river water lapping at her boots, and she pressed the patch into place, and she held it there for the full 40 minutes that the epoxy needed to set, even though her arms shook and her back ached and her teeth chattered. When she let go, the patch held. She climbed up to the upper deck, and she sat down, and she looked out at the river, and very quietly, without making a sound, she began to cry, not from sadness, from something else, from the realization that she had just done something she had not believed 2 weeks ago that she was capable of doing, and if she could do that, she could do something else. And if she could do something else, then maybe, just maybe, the story she had been telling herself about who she was had been wrong all along. Spring turned into summer. The boat changed slowly. So did Margaret. The lower deck stopped taking on water. Margaret cleared it out, scrubbed it down, let it dry. She found, in the process, that the lower deck was much larger than she had realized, because it ran the full length of the boat under the upper deck, and most of it had simply been lost behind years of debris. She found old furniture, a small cast-iron stove with a cracked door, which she repaired with high-temperature epoxy, and a piece of stove gasket from a junk shop. She found a brass ship's bell, tarnished almost black, which she polished over the course of a week of evenings until it shone. She found a folded oilcloth chart of this stretch of river, dated 1962, which she pinned to the cabin wall above the bench. And she found, behind a built-in cabinet whose door had been nailed shut for decades, a wooden box. She did not open the box right away. She set it on the table in the cabin, and she looked at it for 2 days. The box was about the size of a large book. It was made of dark wood, possibly walnut, and it had a small brass latch. The latch was not locked. It was simply tarnished shut from years of disuse. Margaret had a feeling about the box. She could not have explained the feeling, except to say that she felt the way a person feels in a quiet house when they realize they are not actually alone in it. She finally opened the box on a Sunday morning, with the cabin door propped open and the river light coming in pale and gold across the floor. Inside the box was a stack of papers, a small leather notebook, 3 black and white photographs, an envelope addressed in careful handwriting to Mr. Henry Holloway, Pikeville, this state. Margaret read the name twice. She read it a third time. She sat down on the bench. Her own grandfather, on her father's side, the man she had only ever heard about in fragments, the man who had supposedly drowned in a river accident before her father was even old enough to remember him, had been named Henry Holloway, and he had lived in Pikeville. And the date stamped on the envelope was 1971. She did not open the envelope that day. She did not have the courage. She put the box back on the table, and she walked out onto the upper deck, and she stood at the rail for a long time, watching the river move, while the world around her quietly rearranged itself into a shape she did not yet understand. She was 23 years old. She had bought a sunken riverboat for $10 on the worst night of her life, and the boat, it was beginning to seem, had been waiting for her. If you are hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Margaret opened the envelope 3 days later. She did it in the morning, with the cabin door locked, with the brass lamp turned on even though it was light outside, with both hands on the table to keep them from shaking. The paper inside was folded into thirds. The handwriting was the same as on the front of the envelope. She unfolded it slowly, and she read it once all the way through without stopping, and then she read it again, and then she set it down on the table, and she pressed both palms flat against her eyes, and she sat there in the cabin of the boat she now owned, and she let the truth of what she was holding settle into her, layer by layer, the way silt settles into the bottom of a slow river. The letter was from her grandfather, Henry Holloway, and it was addressed to his son, her father, who had been 7 years old in 1971. Henry had written the letter. The letter explained, because he was about to do something dangerous, and he wanted his son to have the truth of it written down somewhere, in case something went wrong. Henry Holloway had been the captain of a small commercial riverboat on this exact stretch of water. The boat was named the Bright Marie, after his wife. He had bought her cheap from a bankruptcy sale in 1968, and he had spent 3 years fixing her up, and he had begun running freight on her, small loads, lumber, feed, the occasional barrel of something bigger, between the small river towns up and down this part of the state. The Bright Marie was his livelihood. She was also, the letter said, the home he was building for his family, because he and his wife and his small son had been living in a one-room rental over a hardware store, and the upper cabin of the riverboat was going to be theirs just as soon as he finished fitting it out. Margaret stopped reading. She looked around the cabin. The small bench, the fold-down table, the round window, the brass lamp, the hooks on the wall where she had hung her denim jacket. The cabin had been built for a family. Her family. Her grandfather had built it with his own hands. She had been sleeping in a room her grandfather had been making for her father, before her father had ever been old enough to live in it. She forced herself to keep reading. The letter explained that Henry Holloway had recently come into possession of something that belonged to other people. Not stolen. Found. He had been hauling a load of old furniture out of foreclosed farmhouse 2 counties up, and inside a false bottom and wardrobe, he had found a leather satchel containing several $1,000s in old cash and a sheaf of land deeds and a will. The will had been written by a woman named Cora Lee Whitfield, and it had been hidden, the letter said, because Cora Lee Whitfield had been afraid of the people who would inherit if her wishes were not followed. The will, Henry wrote, left a parcel of land on this very river, 82 acres of hardwood bottomland and a half-mile of waterfront, to her daughter, Annabelle Whitfield, who had been disowned by the rest of the family for marrying a man they did not approve of. The official will, the one that had been filed in the county courthouse, left everything to Cora Lee's brother instead. The brother had taken the 82 acres. He had logged the hardwoods. He had sold off the river frontage in lots. Annabelle Whitfield, the letter said in Henry's careful hand, was now living in a small house in Pikeville with her husband and 3 children, and she did not know that her mother had ever tried to leave her anything at all. Henry Holloway had decided to make it right. He had hired a lawyer in the next town over, a man he trusted. He had begun the process of having the hidden will authenticated. He had reached out, very carefully, to Annabelle Whitfield, and he had told her gently that he had something to show her. He had also, the letter said, been threatened twice by men he did not name in the letter, but who had made it very clear to him that the 82 acres on the river were not going to be reopened, and that he would do well to remember he was a riverboat captain with a young family. He was writing the letter, he said, because if anything happened to him before he finished what he had started, he wanted his son to know that his father had not been a coward, and he wanted his son to know where the documents were, so that the truth could still be told one day, when his son was old enough to tell it. The documents, the letter said, were in a wooden box in the false bottom of the built-in cabinet behind the captain's bench, on the lower deck of the Bright Marie. The Bright Marie. Margaret looked up at the wall. The oilcloth chart from 1962 was pinned above the bench. Below the chart, on the wall beside the cabin door, was the small brass plaque she had cleaned a month earlier, the plaque she had assumed had simply come with the boat. She had cleaned it without really reading it, and now she stood up and she walked over to it, and she read it for the first time. M/V Bright Marie. Hull number, registration date, port of origin. Her hand was shaking. She walked out onto the upper deck. She looked at the bow of her boat, at the curve of the letters that had almost faded away under decades of peeling paint. The letters she had thought might start with a B. They started with a B. The B was the beginning of Bright. She was standing on the boat her grandfather had built, the boat her grandfather had been killed on. Because Henry Holloway, the letter, in its final lines, had not survived, the letter had been mailed by his lawyer, after his death, to his wife, who had never opened it, because she had not been able to bear it. The lawyer had told her only that her husband had asked for it to go to her in the event of his death. The lawyer had not told her what was in it. Henry Holloway had drowned in 1971. The official report said, in a freak boating accident, in a stretch of river that he had run 1,000 times. The boat, the Bright Marie, had been declared a total loss and had been towed to this very sandbar by the man who had bought the salvage rights for almost nothing. That man's name, written on the back of the bill of sale that Margaret had found, folded inside the wooden box, was the same surname as the brother who had inherited Cora Lee Whitfield's estate. Margaret sat down on the deck of her boat. She sat there for a long time. The river moved past her. The willows on the far bank moved in the wind. A heron called once, and was answered by another, and was silent. She understood now why the boat had felt, since the first night she had stepped onto it, like a place that had been waiting. It had been waiting for someone to find what was in the box. It had been waiting for 40 years. And by the strangest, most impossible accident, by the simple fact that a young woman with $10 in her pocket had walked down to this riverbank on the worst night of her life, the boat had finally been found by the right person, Henry Holloway's granddaughter, the only person in the world who would care. Margaret did not move quickly. She had learned, in the months since she had come to the river, that the river itself did not move quickly, and that things which moved too quickly along it tended to end badly. She made a plan. She went to Walter Coombs first. She showed him the letter. She showed him the contents of the box. Walter read everything twice. Then he sat for a long time with his coffee thermos in his hands, looking out the dusty window of his small office at the boat that had sat on his sandbar for 30 years. Then he said, "Miss Holloway, I knew your grandfather." Margaret stared at him. "I was a young man," Walter said. "I worked the docks up in Pikeville. I knew the Bright Marie. I knew Henry. I was at his funeral. There were things about how he died that didn't sit right with anybody on this river. But back then, you didn't ask questions about certain families. You just didn't." He paused. "I bought this boat from the salvage company in 1986 because I always thought somebody ought to have looked after her, and nobody did. I didn't know what was in her. I swear to you, I just knew she shouldn't be sitting at the bottom of the river." His eyes were wet. "I am so sorry, Miss Holloway. I am so very sorry." Margaret reached across the desk and took his hand. "You sold her to me for $10, she said quietly. "You taught me how to fix her. You don't owe me anything. Walter, you gave me everything." Walter nodded. He could not speak. The lawyer Margaret eventually hired was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Reyes, whose office was above a hardware store in the county seat, and who had a reputation, Walter said, for not being afraid of anybody. Patricia Reyes read the letter, examined the contents of the wooden box, made copies of every document, and then sat very still for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Miss Holloway, do you understand what you have here?" Margaret said, "I think so." Patricia Reyes said, "I want to make sure. You have an authenticated handwritten will, dated 1969, sign and witness. That leaves a substantial parcel of land to a woman whose descendants are still alive in this county. You have a contemporaneous letter from a man who was murdered, in my opinion, for trying to deliver that will to its rightful heir. You have a chain of custody that ties the suppression of that will directly to the family that benefited from its suppression, and that family, Miss Holloway, is still very much in this county, and is still very much sitting on the proceeds of that land. Miss Holloway, this is not a small matter. This is going to make a great deal of noise. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about the question for a long time. She thought about her grandfather, who had died trying to deliver a stranger's truth to her. She thought about Annabelle Whitfield, who must be an old woman now, if she was still alive at all, who had spent her entire life believing her mother had not loved her enough to remember her. She thought about her father, who had grown up without a father, and who had never been told why. She thought about herself, 23 years old, who had been told her whole life that she was not the kind of person things worked out for. And she thought about the boat, the Bright Marie, sitting patient on a sandbar for 40 years, waiting. "Yes," Margaret said, "I am prepared." The investigation that followed took 11 months. Annabelle Whitfield was found in a nursing home in Pikeville. She was 86 years old. Her mind was clear. When Patricia Reyes sat down with her and read her the will her mother had written and hidden, Annabelle Whitfield did not cry. She simply closed her eyes for a long time, and then she opened them and she said, I always knew she would not have done that to me. Thank you for bringing her back to me." The descendants of Cora Lee Whitfield's brother, the family that had been living for 40 years on the proceeds of land that had never legally been theirs, did not go quietly. They hired their own lawyers. They made their own phone calls. They suggested, through several intermediaries, that Margaret Holloway might want to consider how dangerous the river could be for a young woman living alone on a boat. Patricia Reyes responded by filing a public records request for every document related to Henry Holloway's death in 1971, and by giving a long, calm interview to a reporter from a regional paper, and by making it very clear, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, that anything that happened to Margaret Holloway from this point forward would be assumed to be the responsibility of the same family, and would be pursued accordingly. The suggestion stopped. The case was settled out of court in the end, because the documents were too clean and the evidence was too clear, and the family did not want a jury looking at any of it. The 82 acres were returned to Annabelle Whitfield and her children. A substantial financial settlement was paid for the value of the hardwoods that had been logged and the river frontage that had been sold. A portion of that settlement, by Annabelle Whitfield's own insistence, over Margaret's quiet objection, was paid to Margaret Holloway in recognition. Annabelle said in the letter she sent through Patricia Reyes, of the fact that without Margaret, none of this would ever come to light, and that Henry Holloway's granddaughter deserved to inherit something from her grandfather's courage, even if it was 40 years late. Margaret used part of the money to finish the Bright Marie. She did not turn her into something she had never been. She kept her a riverboat. She had Walter Coombs and a proper marine carpenter rebuild the lower deck, replace the rotten beams, fix the paddle wheel, and patch the hull properly with cedar planking. She had the cabin on the upper deck restored the way her grandfather had originally drawn it in the small leather notebook from the wooden box, which contained, among other things, his sketch plans for a galley, a small sleeping berth for a child, and a window he wanted to put over the bench so his wife could sit in the morning and watch the river. Margaret had that window installed. The rest of the money she put into a trust. The trust paid for Annabelle Whitfield's nursing home for the remainder of her life. It paid for college for 2 of Annabelle's grandchildren. It paid for the small marina at the bend in the river to be repaired and kept open, with Walter Coombs as its lifetime caretaker, and after him, anyone Walter chose. And it set aside a small annual stipend for the upkeep of the Bright Marie, to be paid out to Margaret Holloway or after her to whoever she chose, on condition that the boat remain a working riverboat on this river, and that the cabin door always remain unlocked during daylight hours, so that anybody walking along the bank who needed a place to sit out of the weather could come aboard and rest. Margaret still lives on the Bright Marie. She is older now, though not very old. She runs small freight up and down this stretch of river, the way her grandfather did. She also runs a kind of informal water taxi for people in the small river towns who need to get somewhere and do not have a car. She does not charge much. She does not need to. In the evenings, she sits on the upper deck, in the chair her grandfather sketched in his notebook, and she watches the willows on the far bank, and she listens to the boat creak underneath her, and she understands the language now. She has understood it for a long time. People sometimes ask her, if they find out the story, why she did it, why she pursued the case, why she gave away most of the money, why she still lives on a working riverboat, when she could have used the settlement to buy a real house on dry land. Margaret always answers the same way. She says, I came to this river with $10 and nowhere to go. The river gave me a boat. The boat gave me my grandfather. My grandfather gave me a truth that was older than I am, and a job to finish that he was not allowed to finish himself. You don't take something like that and trade it for a house. And then she usually says, besides, the river is the house. It always was. If a young woman with $10 in her pocket and no place left to fall could walk down to a riverbank on the coldest night of her life and end up doing what Margaret Holloway did, then the question is not whether starting from nothing is the end of your story. The question is what you are willing to listen to when the world around you is creaking in a language you have not yet learned to understand. Margaret listened to a sunken riverboat for an entire spring before it told her who it was. She listened to an old man at a marina who had nothing to gain from teaching her how to mix epoxy. She listened to the small voice in her own chest that told her to open the wooden box, even when she was afraid of what she would find. She listened to the truth her grandfather had written down for a son who never got to read it, and she carried that truth across 40 years to a woman in a nursing home who had spent her entire life believing she had been unloved. None of that happened because Margaret Holloway was special. It happened because she stayed. Because she did not walk away on the first night, or the second, or the 10th. Because she kept her hands moving, even when they shook, and her eyes open, even when she was afraid. There are few things that happen along the way that nobody who only hears the short version of Margaret Holloway's story ever finds out about. They are the small parts, the parts in between, the parts that are not dramatic enough to put in a newspaper article, and not legal enough to put in a court filing, and not tidy enough to put on the back of a book jacket. But they are the parts that mattered most to Margaret. So I am going to tell them to you now, because the truth is that the case did not move the way Margaret thought it would. The truth is that the 11 months between the night she opened the wooden box and the day Patricia Reyes called to say the settlement had been signed were not 11 months of triumph. They were 11 months of slow, patient, stubborn work, and most of that work was done by Margaret alone on the deck of a boat that was still leaking in 3 places, with hands that still cracked open every morning when she flexed her fingers in the cold. There was no soundtrack. There was no montage. There was only the river and the cabin, and the long, quiet hours of a young woman teaching herself to be the person her grandfather had been counting on. The first thing that happened, after she met with Patricia Reyes for the first time, was that Margaret got scared, properly scared, in a way she had not been since the night she walked down to the riverbank with $10 in her pocket. She had carried the wooden box back to the boat, and she had sat in the cabin with the door locked, and she had thought about the part of the letter where her grandfather had written that he had been threatened twice. She had thought about Patricia Reyes saying, "This family is still very much in this county." She had thought about the suggestions, those careful suggestions that came later through intermediaries, that the river could be a dangerous place for a young woman living alone on a boat. And she had understood, sitting there in the dark with her hands folded in her lap, that she was not safe. She had never really been safe. Of course, homeless people are not safe. Women who are alone are not safe. But this was a different kind of unsafe. This was a kind of unsafe that came with a name and an address and a long memory. And Margaret had to decide, sitting in that cabin, whether she was going to keep walking down the road she had started walking down, or whether she was going to take the wooden box and the letter and the box of documents, and quietly drop the whole thing into the river and tell Patricia Reyes that she had changed her mind and go on living the small, careful life that she had been working so hard to build. She thought about it for 3 days. She did not eat very much. She did not sleep very much. On the third day, she walked across the wooden plank to the bank, and she walked up the road to the marina, and she sat down across from Walter Coombs in his small, dusty office, and she said, "Walter, I am afraid." Walter looked at her over the top of his coffee thermos. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Miss Holloway, the only people in this world who are not afraid are the people who have not been paying attention. The question is never whether you are afraid. The question is what you do while you are afraid." Margaret looked at her hands. They were shaking just a little. "What did my grandfather do, Walter?" Walter took a long, slow breath. "Your grandfather, Miss Holloway, was the most stubborn man I ever met. He was not stubborn the way some men are stubborn, where they get loud about it and they bang their fists on tables. He was stubborn the way the river is stubborn. He just kept moving. He just kept going. He decided what was right, and then he started walking toward it, and the only thing that stopped him was the thing that stopped him." Walter paused. He looked out the window at the boat on the sandbar, and even then, Miss Holloway, even then, he did not actually stop. He just slowed down for 40 years. And then his granddaughter walked down to the river with $10 in her pocket, and he started moving again. So you tell me, what is your grandfather doing right now, Miss Holloway? Because from where I am sitting, it looks an awful lot like he is still walking. Margaret did not answer. She did not need to. She walked back down the road, and she walked back across the plank, and she walked back into the cabin, and she sat down at the table, and she opened a leather notebook her grandfather had drawn his plans in, and she began to copy out by hand every single word of his letter onto a fresh piece of paper. She did not know why she did this. It was something to do with her hands. It was a way of holding on to him while she was afraid. By the time she finished copying the letter, the sun had come up over the willows on the far bank, and she was no longer afraid. She was tired. There was a difference. Tired, you can work with. Afraid, you cannot. She got up, and she put the kettle on the small cast iron stove, and she made herself a cup of tea, and she carried it out to the upper deck, and she watched the river go by, and she said, out loud, to nobody, "All right, Granddad, let's keep walking." The second thing that happened was that Margaret had to learn how to be a witness. Patricia Reyes explained it to her at their second meeting. She said, "Miss Holloway, the documents are very strong, but documents are paper. The other side is going to attack the chain of custody. They are going to suggest that you found the box somewhere else, or that someone planted it, or that you wrote the letter yourself last week. They are going to come after your character. They're going to find every part of your life that looks unstable, and they're going to put it in front of a judge, and they're going to say, this is a young woman with no fixed address, no employment history, no family connections, no reason to be on that boat in the first place, and we should not believe a word she says. Your job, Miss Holloway, is to make that argument as hard as possible to make. Your job is to become, between now and the day this is settled, the most credible witness in the state of this county. That means you keep a job. That means you keep records. That means you do not do anything between now and then that you would not be willing to explain in front of a judge while looking him in the eye. Margaret nodded. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She went to Walter the next morning, and she asked him if he would put her on as a regular employee at the marina, with proper paperwork and a proper paycheck and proper deductions, even if it was only a few hours a week. Walter did. She opened a checking account at the small bank in town, with the help of a bank manager named Diane Pruitt, who had once been a friend of Margaret's mother in school many years ago, and who remembered Margaret's mother as a kind person and who treated Margaret accordingly. She took her bill of sale for the boat, the one Walter had written on the back of a coffee receipt, and she had it properly notarized at the county clerk's office, and she filed it as the legal record of her ownership of the vessel. She wrote down, in a small notebook she carried in her jacket pocket, the date and time and content of every single conversation she had about the case, with anyone, including Walter and Patricia Reyes, and the bank manager, and the man at the post office, and the woman at the diner, where she sometimes ate breakfast on Sundays. She did not tell anyone she did not have to tell about the case. She did not boast. She did not speculate. She did not give interviews, even when, eventually, two reporters from regional papers came down to the marina and asked her if she would. She said, every time, the same thing. She said, I am not the story. The story is what was done to a woman named Annabelle Whitfield, and the people who can tell that story are our own family and my lawyer and the documents themselves. And she went back to scraping paint or fixing the railing on the upper deck or hauling lumber, and the reporters wrote down what she said, and they went away, and they wrote their articles, and the articles, because Margaret had said so little, were all the more powerful for it. By the time the case was settled, 11 months later, the thing Patricia Reyes had been most afraid of, that the other side would come after Margaret's character, had become impossible. There was nothing to come after. Margaret Holloway had spent 11 months becoming a young woman so visibly steady, so visibly grounded, so visibly hard-working, that the suggestion she was unreliable would have been laughed out of any room in the county. The third thing that happened was Annabelle. Margaret had been hesitant at first to meet her. Patricia Reyes was handling the legal communications. Margaret had not felt, in those first weeks, that she had any right to introduce herself directly to the woman whose entire life her grandfather had been trying to repair. But about 4 months in, Patricia Reyes called the marina, where Margaret had a phone message arrangement with Walter, and she said, Miss Holloway, Annabelle Whitfield has asked to meet you. She has asked specifically. She has said she will not move forward with the case until she has. Margaret stood in Walter's office, holding the phone receiver in her hand for a long moment after Patricia hung up. Walter, who had been listening, said, I'll drive you up to Pikeville on Saturday. We'll go together. You should not do this alone. So that Saturday morning, Margaret put on the only clean shirt she owned, and Walter put on his good canvas coat, and they got into Walter's old pickup truck, and they drove the 2 hours up the river road to Pikeville, and they sat in the small lobby of a nursing home that smelled faintly of soup and floor wax, and they waited for a nurse to bring out an old woman in a wheelchair. Annabelle Whitfield was very small. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. She had been a tall woman once. The photographs Margaret had seen, the ones Patricia Reyes had collected during the investigation, showed a tall, strong-boned young woman with dark hair and a steady gaze. The woman in the wheelchair was bent and white-haired, and her hands were spotted and thin, and her dark gaze was the only thing about her that had not been worn down. The dark gaze was exactly the same as it had been in the photograph from 60 years earlier. Annabelle Whitfield looked at Margaret for a long time without speaking. Then she said, Come closer, child. Margaret came closer. She knelt down beside the wheelchair, because Annabelle was very small, and Margaret did not want to be looking down at her. Annabelle reached out one of her thin, spotted hands and put it against Margaret's cheek. You have his face, she said. I never met your grandfather. You understand. I only spoke to him on the telephone, twice. But the lawyer who came to see me last month brought a photograph of him. I have been looking at that photograph for a month. You have his face, child. The same face. The exact same face. Margaret could not speak. Annabelle Whitfield kept her thin hand against Margaret's cheek. I want you to listen to me, Annabelle said. I am 86 years old. I have spent my entire life believing that my mother did not love me enough to leave me anything. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you understand what it is to live for 60 years inside a story that is not true? Margaret nodded. She thought she did understand. A little. Annabelle saw her thinking it. No, child, you do not understand. Not yet. I hope you never do. But I want you to know what you have given me. You have not given me money. Child, you have not given me land. You have given me back my mother. Do you hear me? You have given me back my mother. After 60 years. After I had given up. After I had decided I was going to die believing she had not wanted me. You walked into my life. A girl I have never met, the granddaughter of a man I only spoke to twice, and you brought my mother back to me. Annabelle's eyes were wet now, but she was not crying. She was past crying, Margaret thought. She had used up her crying decades ago. There is no payment for that, child. There is no land that is worth that. There is nothing in the world that is worth that. So you will not refuse anything I give you. Do you hear me? You will not refuse. Because what you have given me cannot be paid for. The most we can do, you and I, is try. Margaret could not speak for a long time after that. She and Walter drove back down the river road in silence. About halfway home, Walter pulled the truck over onto a gravel shoulder, and he put the parking brake on, and he sat with his hands on the steering wheel, looking out at a field of soy that ran down to the water, and he said, very quietly, Miss Holloway, I am going to ask you a question, and you do not have to answer it, but I am going to ask it. Do you know what your grandfather would say to you if he could see what you did today? Margaret shook her head. She could not say it out loud. Walter said it for her. He would say, well done, child. That is what he would say. Just those 3 words. Well done, child. And he would mean it. Margaret put her face in her hands then, and she cried, finally, the way she had been needing to cry for 4 months and had not allowed herself. And Walter Coombs sat next to her on the bench seat of his old pickup truck. And he did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say. And eventually he started the truck again, and he pulled back out onto the river road, and they drove home in silence. And the river ran beside them all the way back to Marina, and Margaret felt, for the first time since the night she had opened the wooden box, that she was not carrying the weight of this thing alone. The 4th thing that happened was the visit. It was a Wednesday evening. Margaret had been working all day on the lower deck, replacing a section of decking that had finally given up the ghost. She had come up to the cabin to wash her hands and put the kettle on, and she had heard a vehicle pull up to the gravel turnaround at the top of the bank. This was not unusual in itself. The marina was up there, and people came and went all day, but it was past closing time at the marina. Walter would have left an hour earlier. Margaret stood very still in the cabin and listened. She heard a car door close. She heard footsteps, 2 sets, walking down the path in the gravel turn around toward the wooden plank. The footsteps stopped at the start of the plank. Margaret reached, very quietly, for the small heavy wrench she kept on the shelf beside the cabin door. She did not turn the brass lamp on. She listened. A man's voice called out from the bank. Miss Holloway? Margaret did not answer. The voice called again. Miss Holloway, my name is David Whitfield. I am Annabelle Whitfield's grandson. My sister Karen is with me. We are not here to bother you. We have brought you something. We will leave it on the bank if you would prefer not to come out. Margaret stood there in the dark cabin, holding the wrench. She thought for a long moment. Then she set the wrench down. She opened the cabin door, and she walked down the stairs to the upper deck. And she walked across the upper deck to the rail. The 2 people on the bank were standing very still. They were both maybe 40 years old. They were dressed simply. The man was holding a small pie tin covered with a clean dishcloth. The woman was holding a folded piece of paper. Miss Holloway, the man said, we are very sorry to come down here without warning. We would have called, but we did not have a way to reach you. Our grandmother Annabelle asked us to bring you something. We did not feel right not bringing it. Margaret stepped onto the plank. She walked across it slowly, mindful of the 3rd step. She got to the bank. She stood about 6 feet away from the 2 of them. The woman, Karen, said, it's a peach pie from our mother's recipe, which was our grandmother's recipe before that. Our grandmother said you should have one. She said she has been thinking about you, and she wanted you to have something from her kitchen, even if she is not in her kitchen anymore. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.